One of the most common questions that certainly my Muslim friends ask, and I've spent many years dialoguing and conversing with Muslims, concerns the Trinity, the Christian belief that God is one God in three persons. Isn't that contradictory? Isn't that nonsensical? Does that not make no sense whatsoever? My Muslim friends over the years have asked me. How do we respond? How do Christians respond to questions around the Trinity? Well, I always think it's helpful to begin by defining our terms carefully. Let's be clear what the Trinity isn't. Christians don't believe in three gods who is one God. My Muslim friends used to like to look at me and say, but 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. Well, that's true, but that's not the Christian claim. The Christian claim is that we believe in one God who is three persons, or as one theologian put it, we believe in one what who is three whos. Well, that still requires some explanation, but that's not necessarily contradictory. Nor I like to say to my Muslim friends is the Christian claim that Jesus, who was a man, became God somehow, perhaps through good behavior, through God adopting him, through Christians worshipping him. That is not the Christian claim either. The Christian claim is that Jesus has always been both fully God and fully man. So that doesn't necessarily solve all of the questions, but let's be clear what we're talking about. But when we talk about the idea that Jesus is God, one of the questions we then have to address is which God are we talking about? You see, over the years, as I've dialogued with people on the question of the Trinity, one of the things I've begun realizing is that the reason that people have problems with the idea that Jesus is God is they have the wrong conception of God. This is the case with my Muslim friends. The God of the Quran is not the same as the God of the Bible. His attributes are entirely different. The God of the Bible is a God who is relational. He relates to humankind. He's a God who is personal, he's a God who can be known. He is a God who is love, and he is a God who has suffered in order to express that love to humankind. The Bible is clear across both Old and New Testaments that those are God's attributes. The God of the Quran, on the other hand, is a God who is remote, a God who is distant, a God who is aloft and aloof and far from us, a God who has never deigned to step down into his creation. Well, now if you ask the question, which of those two conceptions of God would be most likely to take on flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, I think the answer is very clear. It makes sense to talk about the Trinity when you're talking about the God of the Bible. It makes no sense to talk about the Trinity when you're talking about the God of Islam. So let's be sure we're clear what kind of God we're talking about. And then, of course, we come to the question of Jesus. I don't think you can talk about the Trinity and begin exploring that issue without landing very quickly on this question. Was Jesus who he claimed to be? Because the claim that Jesus is part of the identity of God, that Jesus is God made flesh, is not a claim that Christian theologians made up. It's a claim that's there at the heart of the preaching and teaching of Jesus, who by his actions and his teaching and by the authority that he claimed for himself, put himself on an equal footing with God. So we face this question: is Jesus who he claimed to be? Well, the famous Oxford theologian and writer C.S. Lewis famously coined what's come to be known as the trilemma. And it runs like this. You look at what Jesus claimed for himself and the claims that he made, and you're forced to make one of three conclusions. Either Jesus was a liar and a manipulator, cynically manipulating people and making outlandish claims, perhaps to gain personal power. Or he was a lunatic, on a par with someone who thinks he's a fried egg or a poached egg, a complete raving lunatic. Or, said Lewis, you are forced to the third staggering conclusion, that Jesus actually was who he claimed to be. And if he claimed to be God, made flesh, come to walk with us, come to put right, come to die for us that we might be reconciled to God, well, that raises a question. Was he who he claimed to be? And you see, the thing is, if Jesus was, as he claimed, as the Bible claims, as Christians have always claimed, fully God and fully man, that leads to a startling conclusion. You see, if there is a gap between us and God, if we are separated from God by our sin, by our brokenness, by our rebellion, by our self-centeredness, by our wrongdoing, what we need is somebody who can bridge that gap. And the only person who could bridge that chasm between us and God would be somebody who is both fully God and who is both fully human, because only that person can stand on both sides of the gap and bridge it. And that is the claim that the Bible makes. That's the claim that Jesus made. And it leads to something else that C.S. Lewis, who I quoted a moment ago, said. Lewis said, he said, if Christianity is true, it is the most infinitely important news. If it isn't true, it's utter rubbish. It's completely unimportant. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. Who is Jesus is the question that every one of us needs to answer.